Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Leaders of Czechia, Slovakia and Austria meet in Bratislava in the Slavkov format amid rising security pressure from Russia, with hybrid threats intensifying. Coordination matters more than ever. Joining me is Ján Michalčák. He's former head of countering hybrid threats at the Czech Defence Ministry, to assess how united this regional response really is. Mr. Michalčák, welcome to TP World. Thanks for taking the time. Good to see you.
Good evening. Pleasure to be here.
Good evening. So, the whole of Europe is facing hybrid threats, hybrid attacks from Russia. Does this combination, the Slavkov format, actually provide any united defence against those?
That's a really interesting question, and I would have to say that the Slavkov format is a very unlikely alliance, because at least two, if not all three of the members have themselves been the prime targets of hybrid threats and pressure from Russia. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the main topics that was discussed at the meeting of the leaders today was the topic of energy. And basically all three leaders have complained about the exaggerated and overly high energy prices in the region, which may be correct, but we have to realize that energy is the number one weapon that Russia has used against not only the Slavkov countries. So they are suffering, but we have to say, maybe we'll get to that later in the talk, that's partly also due to their own faults in relation to Russia. So it's basically self-inflicted harm.
Yes, I do. As you say, we will get to that in a second. There's a short soundbite from Chancellor Stocker about that very issue. We can have a listen to it now.
As neighboring countries, our economies are particularly closely linked. That is why we have also presented our most important concerns in the form of a joint declaration in the upcoming discussion at the European level. Because if we work together constructively and decisively on this issue, we will achieve more at the European level than we would on our own, and in the interest of our economy and therefore also our citizens. The most urgent task is certainly to reduce energy prices, especially electricity prices.
Now that, to me, carries two messages. On the one hand, they want to reduce energy prices, but also the cost of producing energy, so the emissions taxes and so on that they would be charged. Now, let's talk about the cost of buying that energy. You alluded to it earlier. This is a lever that Russia can use as part of a hybrid threat, can it not?
Definitely. Let's take Slovakia as the prime example here, because Slovakia is still importing the vast majority, I think it's over 80% of its energy, particularly gas, from Russia. And Slovak Prime Minister Fico repeatedly claimed and still claims that this is pretty much the only possibility that Slovakia has. Whereas in reality, the facts on the ground are that Slovakia has got a gas interconnector leading to Poland, so pretty much in plain language, pipes being ready at the Polish border, which could transit almost 95% of all energy needs of Slovakia. But Slovakia has willingly chosen not to use those and instead rely on Russia, in full knowledge of the fact that Russia has been using energy as a weapon. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that by the very nature of geography, the gas pipes leading to Slovakia through Russia, of course, must go through Ukraine, which we all know is a war-torn country because of the war of choice by Russia unleashed on Ukraine, which also drives the prices even further up. So to recap, Slovakia would have options to diversify and get its energy elsewhere. We have offered, as the EU, many options to the Slovaks to get the energy from other, more reliable sources, not torn up by war, for example. but Fico claims that Russia is the cheapest option. Now, hypothetically, could be, but we don't live in a hypothesis. We live in a harsh reality in which Russia is not only waging war on another country, but also artificially inflating the energy prices so that it can force countries like Slovakia into obedience. And in the case of Fico, unfortunately for all of us, that is succeeding.
Right. So what is it that other countries in the Slavkov format, so I'm talking about Austria, of course, and the Czech Republic, can do, if anything, to pressure Slovakia into moving its energy sources elsewhere?
Honestly speaking, there is nothing much that the EU can do to pressure Slovakia. If Slovakia is willingly taking on the risk and willing to accept that self-inflicted harm upon itself, that's their choice. For us, the bigger problem is that the fact that energy is, by the very nature of what we've just described, being made artificially more expensive, prices being inflated, that is then being used by Fico and the other leaders in the Slavkov format as a weapon against the EU, because the EU is being made the scapegoat here and is being claimed by Fico and the others, look, the EU is the one driving the prices up. The other example in here is the talk about the so-called emission allowances, the ETS system, and that is basically the other side of the same coin, and that is being used by Andrej Babiš of Czechia, again, to show that Brussels is basically the enemy here. But the reality is much more nuanced. I don't know if we have time to delve into it, but I'm happy to do so.
Yes, I was actually going to move on to this because it sounds as though Putin is actually leveraging this energy, but in a very indirect political way, to further fragment the European Union, and you know, by implication, the EU support for Ukraine. How do you analyze this situation?
You're absolutely correct. That is very much Putin's success, and we see the EU's fragmentation pretty much happening as we speak. And the Slavkov meeting is one of the examples of that happening real time, basically. And what Putin gains is pretty self-explanatory. He gains the lack of unity, the fading unity in the EU, the arguments that we see happening all the time, basically, and we see the gathering storm, so to speak, of leaders dissatisfied with the EU, or at least claiming that they are dissatisfied, which can then lead to actions that can profit Putin even more, because energy is a weapon that Russia uses, sure, but it's not the number one issue that Putin is concerned with. I'm convinced of that. So if disagreements on topics such as energy continue, which they might in the future, those countries that take issue with the EU's stance on energy, for example, could then start vetoing much more important legislation, such as legislation directly pertaining to Russia, sanctions against Russia, and or support of the EU to Ukraine. And that definitely would be of enormous benefit to Putin. So this is just, for him, the beginning of a larger argument that could spiral to things that he would profit much more from.
Indeed. Now, in terms of, if I can just focus on the impact on the amount of materiel sent to Ukraine, you know, many countries are doing much more than others are. So, for example, Germany seems to have stepped up. Poland has been right from the beginning. How much of an impact is it going to make if these three countries, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Austria, actually pull out and actually, you know, stop supplying Ukraine with military material altogether?
Right. Just looking at the map, it is clear that those three countries are not going to be the backbone of our help to Ukraine, but because, you know, their economies are simply not big enough to carry the weight of our help. But what could very well happen is that they could stop being as helpful in terms of, for example, the logistics. Because let's look at the map. Austria, Czechia, and Slovakia are either directly bordering Ukraine in case of Slovakia, or for the other two countries, they could serve as, at least as logistical support and the logistical hub, or at the very least, by not blocking, for example, the transit of aid heading toward Ukraine, and that in itself is a huge help, of course. And if that should change for any reason, which I don't see happening, at least not for Czechia, at least not now, but if disagreements within the EU should escalate, this is one very palpable impact that we could see, and of course, Ukraine would be the one suffering from that.
Right, so the potential strategic implications for Ukraine as a result of this this grouping. Now, I was wondering, why has Hungary not been invited into this grouping? They seem to have quite similar attitudes towards energy and the EU, but it's been left out. Why?
That's a really good question. I think it's mainly for historical reasons, because the so-called Slavkov format, if I'm not mistaken, has not historically involved Hungary. And for some reason, I don't fully understand, the three leaders wanted to meet themselves in the Slavkov format, and having Hungary would be an outlier. And then I also think that at least one of the leaders, the Austrian Chancellor, and maybe even Babiš to an extent, doesn't really want to be seen that often alongside Viktor Orbán of Hungary, because yes, they have been portrayed as friends in the recent past, but Babiš, for his part, has had a fair share of issues on the domestic front. And he also wants to hedge bets against what might happen in Hungary following the April 26th election,
right,
which, according to the latest polls, Orbán might also lose. So I think for Babiš, being seen with Orbán, he might be perceived as a kind of a toxic persona,
so it suits him
to, but I'm just guessing here.
Yeah, well, it suits him to stay away for the moment. Jan Michalčák, thank you so much, as always, for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good evening.
It was a pleasure, as always.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye.